The day Liam was born was supposed to be the happiest moment of Karen and Michael's lives. After years of waiting, they finally had their first child, a son they could call their own. Karen had prepared for everything except the unsettling calm that washed over her as she held her baby for the first time. She had heard that newborns cry when they enter the world, their first breath a loud wail that signals life and vitality. But Liam didn't cry. He didn't scream or fuss. He simply looked up at her with large, still eyes. The nurses quickly reassured Karen. "Some babies are just quiet," they said with smiles, "nothing to worry about. He's healthy." Michael brushed it off as well. "He's just calm. That's all." He kissed Karen on the forehead, his joy unshaken. But as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Liam remained completely silent. He didn't babble like other babies, didn't gurgle or coo. He never cried for attention, no matter what Karen did. Instead, he watched. His wide, deep eyes followed everything around him. And though he never made a sound, Karen felt like he was absorbing everything. She spent endless hours trying to coax some kind of response from him. She'd sit by his crib, talking softly, singing lullabies, just waiting for him to make a noise, any noise at all. But his only reply was a fixed, intense stare that seemed far too knowing for a child his age. The doctors examined Liam time and again, running tests, checking his hearing, his throat, his development. Every test came back normal. "He's just quiet," they said. "Some children are slow to start talking. Give him time." But deep down, Karen knew something was wrong. One evening, as Karen stood by Liam's crib, watching him sleep, she couldn't suppress the heavy feeling in her chest any longer. She turned to Michael, who was sitting on the bed flipping through a book, and said, "I'm worried, Michael. He should be making sounds by now, shouldn't he?" Michael looked up, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. "He's just developing at his own pace, Karen. He'll speak when he's ready." He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "There's nothing wrong with him, you'll see." But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a delay. It wasn't that Liam couldn't speak. It was as though something was keeping him from speaking. She could feel it in the weight of his gaze, in the unnatural silence that seemed to hang around him like a shadow. Every day, Liam's silence seemed louder. Every night, the house felt just a little bit colder. Karen couldn't help but wonder, was something more than just words being held back inside their son? As Liam grew older, Karen's concern deepened. He was now 2 years old, and while most children his age were learning their first words or making excited sounds, Liam remained eerily quiet. The doctors continued to say he was healthy, but Karen's maternal instinct screamed otherwise. It wasn't just the silence, it was the unsettling way he seemed to watch the world around him, always observing, never interacting. One night, Karen sat in the living room, absent-mindedly folding laundry. Michael was at work late, and the house was unusually quiet, even with Liam playing nearby. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, one of Liam's toys, a small car, rolled across the floor on its own. Karen blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She quickly rationalized it. "It's an old house," she thought. "The floors aren't even." But when she looked over at Liam, she saw him staring at the car with that same intense focus. His small hand was extended toward it, but he wasn't touching it. It sent a shiver down her spine. Later that week, things escalated. It started with doors creaking open and shutting on their own. Karen would be in the kitchen, and the door to the hallway would slowly swing open, as if pushed by an invisible hand. Every time, she would run to check, convinced it was a draft, but the windows would always be closed. And then there was the cold. Karen first noticed it one morning when she went to wake Liam up. His room was frigid, far colder than the rest of the house, even though the heating was on full blast. She wrapped him in a blanket and brought him downstairs, trying to ignore the rising sense of unease. One night, Karen awoke suddenly. The house was deathly still, but she felt something was wrong. She got up, heart pounding in her chest, and tiptoed to Liam's room. When she opened the door, she found him sitting up in bed, wide awake. He was staring at the far corner of the room. Karen's breath caught in her throat. There was nothing there, just shadows cast by the dim nightlight. But the way Liam's eyes were fixed, unblinking, made her skin crawl. "Liam," she whispered, walking slowly toward him. He didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. His gaze stayed locked on the corner of the room. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, cold, almost suffocating. She wrapped her arms around her son and pulled him close. But he remained stiff in her embrace, his eyes never leaving the corner. Karen stayed with Liam the rest of the night, her heart racing every time she glanced toward that empty space. The next morning, Karen confided in Michael, her voice trembling as she recounted the strange things that had been happening. The doors, the cold in his room. Last night he just sat there, staring at nothing like he was watching something I couldn't see. Michael sighed and rubbed his forehead. Karen, it's an old house. Drafts happen. Liam's just a quiet kid. He's probably just having a dream or something. Karen bit her lip, fighting the urge to argue. Michael didn't understand. Cole didn't understand. It wasn't just an old house. It wasn't just the cold. Something was happening to Liam, something they couldn't explain. That evening, things took a more terrifying turn. While Michael was at work again, Karen was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. Liam had finished his meal and was sitting quietly in the living room with his toys. It was almost unsettling how quietly he played, never making a sound, never calling for attention. Then she heard a soft thud. She rushed into the living room to find out the family portrait, the one hanging over the fireplace, had fallen to the ground. The glass was shattered, the frame split in two. But that wasn't the worst of it. Karen's heart raced as she looked around the room, noticing that every single photo frame on the walls and shelves had been turned face down. Her hands shook as she reached for one of the frames, flipping it upright, only to find the smiling faces of her family staring back at her. She turned to Liam, her voice shaking. Did you see anyone in here?" Liam didn't move. He was staring at the empty space on the wall where the family portrait had hung, his face blank, as if the sight of it meant nothing to him. Karen's hands trembled as she cleaned up the broken glass, her mind racing. It was no longer just in her head. Something was wrong with their house, and something was very wrong with their son. The strangeness that had settled over their home began to suffocate Karen. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of her vision seemed to carry the weight of something unseen. Michael remained skeptical, brushing off her concerns with strained patience, but Karen could feel it, the presence, lurking in the silence of their home. One cold afternoon, desperate for air, Karen left the house for a walk through town. She needed to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to every room. Liam, as usual, remained silent as she bundled him up and placed him in his stroller. As Karen passed the old church near the edge of town, she noticed a figure standing by the stone wall. The man was old, his skin weathered and cracked, as though he had been carved from the very stones he stood near. His eyes, sharp and bright, followed her as she approached. Karen felt a chill crawl up her spine, but she tried to ignore it, pushing the stroller past the man. Just as she thought she was in the clear, the man's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You have a son," he said, his tone low but filled with certainty. Karen froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly, gripping the stroller handle tightly. "Yes," she answered cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "He doesn't speak, does he?" Karen's breath caught in her throat. How could this man know that? She had never seen him before, never spoken to him. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she stepped in front of Liam's stroller protectively. "How do you know that?" Karen demanded, trying to mask the fear in her voice. The man's gaze hardened, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to carry a weight beyond the physical. "He carries a curse," he said, his words like stones being dropped into Karen's stomach. "A curse that has been passed down through your bloodline for generations. His silence is not by choice, it's a burden." Karen's heart raced. "A curse? What are you talking about?" she asked, stepping back instinctively. The man took another step closer, his face shadowed by the late afternoon light. "The curse silences the innocent until they are ready to speak the truth. But the truth will not set you free. When your son speaks," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "you will wish he hadn't." Karen felt the world spinning around her. "What do you mean? What truth? What is happening to my son?" But the man only shook his head. "His silence protects you all. But it won't last forever." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Karen standing frozen in place, her mind swirling with fear and confusion. She looked down at Liam, who sat quietly in his stroller, his wide, unblinking eyes staring straight ahead. Karen felt a wave of nausea. The man's words echoed in her mind. You will wish he hadn't. That night, Karen couldn't shake the conversation with the stranger. His words rattled in her mind, making it impossible for her to think clearly. She kept glancing at Liam, who was sitting quietly on the floor, drawing in his notebook as he often did. Michael noticed her unease as he entered the living room, sitting down beside her. You okay? He asked, concern finally creeping into his voice. Karen looked at him, unsure how to explain what had happened. There's something wrong, she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. I met a man today. He knew about Liam, about his silence. He said Liam's carrying a curse. Michael's brow furrowed. A curse? Karen, this is getting out of hand. Maybe we should talk to a specialist, someone who can help us deal with. Before he could finish, Karen's attention was drawn to Liam's notebook. He had just finished drawing something. Her heart sank as she leaned over to look. Liam had drawn a dark figure, a faceless figure, tall and looming, standing next to him. But what terrified Karen most was that Liam had drawn himself with his mouth stitched shut. Liam? Karen whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hand shaking as she touched his shoulder. What is this? Liam remained silent, his eyes staring blankly at the image he had just created. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Karen gasped, her heart racing as she fumbled for the light switch. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then she heard it. A voice, soft, chilling, and not Liam's. Help. Karen's blood ran cold. Her hand finally found the light switch, and when the room flooded with light again, Liam was standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide, his lips unmoving. But the voice, it had come from him. Karen fell to her knees, shaking. Michael rushed to her side, grabbing her shoulders. Karen, what's going on? Karen's voice broke as she looked at her husband with wild eyes. He spoke. But it wasn't him, Michael. It wasn't his voice. Karen and Michael stared at their son, standing motionless in the middle of the room, his wide eyes blank, his face pale. The shadows in the room seemed to dance, twisting and curling around the edges of the walls, moving as if they were alive. Michael moved toward Liam cautiously. Buddy, are you okay? He asked, his voice strained, fear creeping into every word. But Liam didn't respond. He stood still, staring at the corner of the room, just like that night Karen had found him watching the darkness. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered once more. This time, the darkness that filled the room was thicker, almost tangible, pressing against them like an invisible weight. Karen gripped Michael's arm, her breathing ragged. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the darkness, louder and more menacing than before. It wasn't Liam's voice, but it was coming from him. The curse can only be broken when the truth is spoken. Karen screamed, reaching for Liam, but in the blink of an eye, the lights flashed back on. Liam was gone. Karen's heart raced as her eyes darted around the room, searching frantically for her son. Liam, she cried, her voice breaking. Michael stood frozen, his face pale, unable to process what had just happened. The room was silent now, but the weight of the curse, the unseen force that had taken their son, was heavier than ever. As Karen collapsed to the floor, sobbing, Michael knelt beside her, his own tears spilling over. We have to find him. We have to figure out what's happening to him, Michael whispered, his voice breaking. But as they clung to each other, the only thing they could hear were faint, chilling whispers they couldn't understand. As Karen and Michael remained frozen in horror, their son missing, the viewer is left with an agonizing question. What is the truth that Liam must speak? And when he does, will it save them or destroy them all?